Apparently 5 days and 20 hours ago I started The Witcher 3, and I feel like I'm just past the halfway point. It's pretty hard to tell actually, for two reasons. One is that the narrative structure of these big massive sandbox games are usually a zigzaggy wobbly mess of moving goalposts and shifting priorities. By the time most of these stories reach the midpoint, it's hard to tell what your main character is really supposed to be doing anymore. Reason two is that the in-game playtime counter is a buggy, broken mess. 5 days and 20 hours is 140 hours total, and there's no way that can be right. But maybe, by the time I fully exhaust this game and do everything I want to do, that might be a more realistic figure. Because The Witcher 3 was advertised to take about 200 hours to do everything, which presumably would include even the boring stuff. Grand Theft Auto 5 was said to be a big open-world experience that's 100 hours long. This hours race was even going on 5 years ago, when Fallout New Vegas was advertised to take hundreds of hours to explore. And more recently, a Bethesda producer dropped a quote that has reporters saying that Fallout 4 could take up to 400 hours to see everything. So I'm gracefully gliding through most of the side quests in The Witcher and generally enjoying myself doing it, but with so many games this size coming out, I have to wonder, is the incredible length of these things really a good thing? Who has time for all this? And how can something truly stay interesting after so long? Even before the apparent ice age that I must have started this game in, I went to GDC and saw a presentation claiming that the 3-act story structure doesn't usually work very well for video games. Richard Rouse and Tom Abernathy made the argument that a player's own motivations can differ too much from both that of the plot and the characters to effectively stick game stories on top of Hollywood story outlines. For a game's equivalent to Act 1, a long, drawn-out exposition sequence setting up the story may turn into an overly long, hackneyed tutorial level. Towards the end of Act 2, when our heroes at their lowest point and struggling to pick themselves back up, their actions are going to be dictated by players that are, at that point, finally familiar with the game's controls and mechanics and probably hungry for just more action. You might have noticed that I just used clips from short games there. Linear games, cinematic games. Games that'll take about a day or two, maybe a weekend. Because once any single-player, story-driven game has hundreds of hours of content, it no longer has the luxury of falling back on any classic story structure. Because, frankly, no other self-contained stories last as long as video games do. Hell, you can read War and Peace in about 32 hours. In the GDC talk, they suggested that serialized drama may be a better model to follow, citing The Walking Dead's episodes as an easy example, and The Last of Us's serialized seasons as a bit of a stretchier one. And then they said that for open-world games, narrative structure doesn't really work at all. Which is understandable. People have been making fun of that for 15 years, starting at the moment Ryu swore to take care of this kitten, minutes after we saw him swear to take revenge for his father's murder. But I don't know how much I agree with the notion that there's no, or not at least some ambiguous, unknown, type of story structure holding these open world games together. There is something there, a structured beginning and an ending for sure, but even though the middle is all jumbly, it still follows some kind of rules. And for the open world RPGs they cite in particular, you have a very, very episodic structure. I remember back when I was playing through the hundreds of hours of content in New Vegas, I kept wanting to compare the game to The Twilight Zone. Its open world was essentially a collection of side quests that all felt like short stories. There were self-contained little episodic adventures that didn't really relate to one another, but each one had a beginning, a middle, and a bizarre end that all followed the same core themes. You can play them out of order and still get the message of the overall game, and each one will help you understand what's going on in the greater world containing them. Likewise, you can watch The Twilight Zone out of order and still understand the message of the overarching series, and also see what kind of picture they were painting of the world back then, which is a very convenient example for Fallout, actually. But that's what I think makes the core difference between games with hundreds of hours that feel like something I'd actually want to play, versus hundreds of hours of methodical, lifeless chores. That difference is whether or not each hour tells its own interesting story. The good examples would be the Elder Scrolls, the Fallouts, and now The Witcher 3, where the small little side quests and player-driven explorations are all linked to names and faces with world building tied to all of them, and a protagonist whose role is versatile enough to go on hundreds of little mini-adventures. This is where The Witcher got really lucky to be based off The Witcher. Our character is a master of solving minor problems. He can help out emperors or peasants, and doesn't really look out of place in either situation. Fallout can make a dilapidated shack interesting. Notes and trash strewn about can tell its own little story. The architecture, the furniture placement, and even what types of monsters are living in any given cave in Skyrim will do the same. And The Witcher 3 goes all out by giving even the most minor of side quests entire minutes of cutscenes and dialogue that all thoroughly explain the hows and whys behind each challenge's very existence. In short, all of that optional content is a coherent part of a coherent world. Compare that to the bad examples, the Assassin's Creeds, the Watch Dogs, and probably the most egregious offender being The Crew, in which you click on a spot on the map to instantly teleport to the Comcast Xfinity Speed Challenge. How did my guy get there? Who arranged this race? Should I feel bad about it? Should I feel good? I already feel bad about it, maybe because I'm thinking too much. The typical Ubisoft open world game formula has side questy activities that just teleport themselves into and out of the world with a button prompt. They don't follow the theme, they follow less of a coherent structure, they don't make for a coherent world. And along the way, a whole lot of intrusive HUD markers and tutorial pop-ups will spoil the illusion of it being an organic world in the first place. Meanwhile, the main story will have subplots become main plots that get tossed around and thrown out to become minor fetch quests that become major fetch quests, to the point where the story is too long to be coherently followed and the side quests start to all look the same. And more often than not, there isn't enough diversity and polish between all of those side activities to justify the scope of a massive open world game in the first place. Far Cry 4 had this problem where certain categories of side activities, the bomb defusal missions in particular, felt like they were just copy-pasted verbatim over and over again onto different parts of the map. And it's not like The Witcher doesn't suffer from that either. The little loot caches, the smuggler's treasures, and the guarded chests have yet to yield any good loot or XP rewards. They're just boxes on the checklist. It also has these ridiculous horse races that the engine, the AI, and the controls were clearly not built for. But it has wheat for its chaff. Even those insignificant loot caches have notes attached to them. They have stories. And it looks like most of my hours are going to be spent doing detailed and thought-out side quests that oftentimes intersect and relate to one another to further give the impression that the whole map is one big, but logically consistent place. In both cases, for the good and the bad examples, quantity is going to overtake quality once these big open-world games creep into the hundreds of hours. And managing some level of quality, by making sure that the player's decisions and stories remain interesting over time, takes legwork. It takes creativity and passion, and it also requires structure. All that optional content, despite how much of it there is, should make sense. It should fit some sort of theme and fit into the world and contribute to the world. Any singular story stretched out for hundreds of hours isn't going to be easy to follow after such a long time, so these games are more about the journey, not the destination. At that point, the longevity of our characters' distractions might not make sense in the world of the pre-written cutscene stories, but at least the little stories belonging to just the player will make sense and feel special.